What is supply and demand? This economic principle is one of the most frequently referenced, but also misunderstood in all of economics. So in this video, we're going to break down what supply and demand actually are and how they interact to determine prices. So supply and demand are two opposing forces that together determine the price of a product or service. In other words, it's how much people want something and how much they can afford to pay for it. The higher the price, the lower the demand because at higher prices, fewer people will want to buy the product or be able to afford it. Conversely, when the price is lower, more people will want to buy the product and more people will be able to afford it, resulting in higher demand. Imagine a market for coffee. Producers will want to sell more coffee because it's expensive, but consumers won't want to buy as much coffee because it's too expensive, meaning there won't be enough demand to absorb the available supply. They act as an invisible hand that guides the price of a product or service to the equilibrium price, where the quantity demanded by consumers equals the quantity supplied by producers. But it is important to note that the equilibrium price and quantity are not fixed, and they can change over time. As consumer income rises, the demand for normal goods, which are goods that are consumed as usual, tends to rise as well. For example, if incomes in the United States suddenly increased, the demand for coffee would likely increase as well. However, the demand for inferior goods, which are goods that are not consumed as usual, tends to fall as consumer incomes rise. Imagine that there is a sudden increase in demand for electric cars due to government subsidies that make them more affordable. Imagine that there is a drought that reduces the supply of coffee beans, causing the supply curve for coffee to shift to the left. This would lead to a new equilibrium price and quantity. The new equilibrium price would be higher because it costs more to produce coffee due to the drought, and the new equilibrium quantity would be lower because producers are selling less coffee at the new equilibrium price. This would cause the demand curve for electric cars to shift to the right, leading to a new equilibrium price and quantity. It is important to understand these concepts in order to make informed decisions as a consumer and as a producer. We cover a wide range of topics from basic principles to current events. You can find our videos on various platforms. And don't forget to subscribe to get notified when we release new videos. The new equilibrium price would be higher because consumers are now willing to pay more for electric cars. And the new equilibrium quantity would be higher because consumers are buying more electric cars at the new equilibrium price. An example of an inferior good is instant coffee. As incomes rise, consumers may switch to higher quality coffee, such as specialty coffee, and the demand for instant coffee will fall. Other factors that can affect demand include consumer tastes and preferences, the prices of related goods, such as substitutes and complements, and consumer expectations about future prices. For example, if there is a sudden increase in demand for coffee due to a change in consumer preferences, the equilibrium price, one of the most important factors, is the cost of production. If the cost of producing a good or service increases, the supply will decrease because it will be less profitable for producers to sell the product. For example, if the price of coffee beans increases due to a poor harvest, the supply of coffee will decrease because it will be less profitable to sell coffee. Other factors that can affect supply include the prices of related goods, such as substitute goods and complementary goods, the number of sellers in the market, and producer expectations about future prices. And quantity will shift upwards as the market adjusts to the new demand. Similarly, if there is a decrease in supply due to a natural disaster that destroys coffee crops, the equilibrium price and quantity will shift downwards as the market adjusts to the new supply. As a result, coffee shops will compete with each other to sell their surplus coffee, driving the price down until it reaches the equilibrium price. If the price of coffee is set very low, say $1 per cup, there will be a shortage of coffee because demand will be higher than supply. Consumers will want to buy more coffee because it's cheap, but producers won't be able to supply enough coffee to meet that demand because it is not profitable to do so at such a low price. As a result, coffee shops and producers will compete for a limited supply of coffee beans, driving the price up until it reaches the equilibrium price. Demand is typically represented by a downward sloping demand curve, which illustrates the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. They're like the people in an argument where each person wants something different, and the outcome of their disagreement is the market price. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Now let's get back to supply and demand. Let's take a closer look at the factors that can cause shifts in supply and demand, which can result in changes in the equilibrium price and quantity. The interaction of supply and demand occurs at the equilibrium price and quantity. The equilibrium price is the price at which the quantity demanded by consumers equals the quantity supplied by producers. At this price, there is no surplus or shortage of the product, and the market clears. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity of the product or service that is demanded by consumers and supplied by producers at the equilibrium price. Demand refers to the consumer's side of the equation and represents the amount of a product or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price. Supply represents the producer's side of the equation and refers to the amount of a product or service that producers are willing and able to sell at a given price. In other words, it is how much businesses want to sell something and how much they can afford to sell it for. When the price of a product is high, businesses are generally willing to supply more of it because they can make a higher profit margin. Conversely, when the price is low, businesses are generally willing to supply less of the product because their profit margins are lower. Supply is typically represented by an upward sloping supply curve, which illustrates the direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now let's look at supply. Now that we understand the basics of supply and demand, let's see how they work together to determine the price of a product or service. To illustrate how supply and demand work together to determine the equilibrium price and quantity, let's look at an example. On the other hand, if the price of coffee is set to high, say $5 per cup, there will be a surplus of coffee because supply will be higher than demand. In this way, supply and demand work together to keep the market in balance. Now that we understand how supply and demand work to determine the price of a product or service, let's start with demand. Several factors can cause the demand curve to shift. One of the most important factors is consumer income. Now let's look at supply. Several factors can cause the supply curve to shift as well. Now that we understand the factors that can affect supply and demand, let us look at some examples of how changes in supply and demand can affect the equilibrium price and quantity. Let's start with an example of an increase in demand. Now let's look at an example of a decrease in supply. So as you can see, changes in supply and demand can have a significant impact on the price and quantity of a product or service. And if you want to learn more about economics, be sure to check out our other videos. Thanks for watching.